American forces are barely able to hold the ambush. North Vietnamese troops close in from every angle, threatening to overrun their fortified positions and punch through to the heart of the highlands. It's 1966, and the future of American strategy in Southeast Asia hangs in the balance. Aboard a UH-1 Huey, a young gunner braces behind his M60. He is now the last line of defense. He leans out, eyes scanning the tree line, trying to locate the enemy, but the North Vietnamese fire first. The Huey trembles as the pilot wrestles the controls. The gunner grips the frame, heart pounding. He knows there's only one way to make it out alive. He jumps, hurtling from the doorway, just seconds before impact. For a split second, the battle goes silent. Then the ground slams into him. Somehow, he's alive. But as he pushes himself up from the jungle floor, his stomach turns cold. He's now just another American lost in the jungle, alone, unarmed, and staring down at a dozen enemy rifles already pointed at him. The Ivy Warriors. On July 4th, 1945, the skies over America lit up with fireworks like never before. Across the Atlantic, American boots were marching across the ruined boulevards of Berlin. The Nazi regime had crumbled. In a few weeks, the war would finally be over. Among the American forces hoisting the Stars and Stripes over Germany were the men of the 4th Infantry Division, the so-called Ivy Warriors. Over the course of the last few months, these soldiers had become legends, becoming the first Allied troops to hit Utah Beach during D-Day, storming ashore from Higgins boats under a hailstorm of machine gun fire and artillery. They'd fought their way off the sand, through hedgerows and sniper nests, clearing up miles of enemy-infested terrain and carving the way for the final liberation of Europe. When winter came and the French Ardennes froze, it was the 4th Infantry who dug in, bracing against the German counteroffensive. Men fell in the snow by the dozens, but not a single inch of ground was surrendered. Again and again, they broke enemy assaults and sent the Wehrmacht retreating. Decades later, when a new American crisis erupted halfway across the globe, Washington knew exactly who to call. This time, the battlefield wasn't beaches or city streets. It was the brutal, rugged jungle of Vietnam, a land of booby-trapped trails, snipers camouflaged as roots, and hidden tunnels that could swallow a platoon whole, or erupt in fire without warning. Officials had hoped the war could be swiftly won. Yet, as helicopters delivered the first U.S. combat troops over the Central Highlands, they were met with a nightmare. In the Adrang Valley, PAVN forces sprang ambushes, swallowing entire companies in seconds. At X-Ray, and later the Albany landing zones, American units were surrounded and hammered by wave after wave of North Vietnamese troops using close quarters tactics that rendered air and artillery support almost useless. Gunfire lit the jungle as radios screamed for support. Within minutes, dozens were gone. Men were forced to fight with bayonets, rifle stocks, and even their fists. Desperate to hold the line, others called in artillery on their own positions, with some men succumbing to friendly fire. Some units lost over 50% of their men in the first battles of the war. Into a green hell. The Ivy Warriors touched down in Vietnam in 1966. The Central Highlands were a green inferno. Dense, tangled jungle clawed at every step, and the skies opened daily with monsoon rains so thick they could drown a helicopter mid-descent, turn trails into rivers, and bury landing zones in mud. Mosquitoes, laced with malaria, bit through uniforms, threatening to take out men faster than enemy fire could. If they wanted to survive long enough to face the PAVN, the men of the 4th Infantry Division would first have to turn their rudimentary outpost in the jungle into fortified cities. Waterproof bunkers rose from the earth, alongside artillery fire bases and runways for transport aircraft carved into the dirt. As Americans transformed the mountains, the Ivy Division found an unexpected ally, the Montagnards. These groups had long suffered under Viet Cong brutality. Now, with the Americans, they had a chance to fight back. The Montagnards led U.S. troops through hidden trails, across snake-infested ravines, and into the hearts of mountains no map showed. They fought alongside the GIs, guiding them through ambush zones and teaching them to read the land like locals. In just a couple of months, U.S. forces had anchored a string of forts across the region. Among them stood Plai Jareng, a military compound near the Cambodian border, serving as a base from which the Americans could watch, strike, and intercept the flow of enemy troops from the west. But such a stronghold could never stand unchallenged for long. By October, intelligence reports started coming in, revealing that a massive PABN buildup was forming just across the border. The enemy was preparing to strike, not just at Plaie-Durang, but at the heart of the Central Highlands. Opening blows. In the months leading up to the battle, American forces had clashed repeatedly with North Vietnamese troops. Operations Paul Revere 1, 2, and 3 had managed to stall their advances, but only temporarily. The PABN didn't retreat. They repositioned, inching ever closer to U.S. forward bases, testing defenses, studying weaknesses, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on October 18, 1966. The Ivy Warriors of the 4th Infantry Division assumed battle positions and launched Operation Paul Revere 4 alongside units from the 25th Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 101st Airborne Division. Men moved in staggered formations across the jungle, eyes scanning the trees, hands tied on their rifles. Suddenly, a bullet whizzed past an American soldier's helmet. The troops dropped to the jungle floor. The men fired into the brush against an enemy they couldn't see. The firefight raged on, but just as fast as they appeared, the enemy vanished. However, the Americans knew better than to breathe easy. This wasn't a retreat. It was a regrouping. A radio man, crouched behind a rotting log, called in for immediate aerial support. Moments later, the jungle shook as the roar of an AC-47 Spooky gunship echoed overhead. Its miniguns opened fire, spraying 7.62mm rounds into suspected PABN positions, directing fire toward known mortar nests and radio sites, and sending enemy units scrambling for cover. As dusk fell, the American soldiers were on their own once again. The darkness made it nearly impossible for the aerial forces to identify any enemy positions on the ground. It was then that the PABN struck back. U.S. troops hunkered down as the first shots came at them, launching into a full-on assault. For 2 hours, the Americans were under siege. They returned fire into shifting silhouettes, never knowing how close the enemy was until they were nearly within arm's reach. Above, F-4 Phantom jets circled helplessly. The battle below was too tight, and pilots couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy positions. But they had to act, and ultimately opened fire. Trees snapped like bones, and the earth trembled. Still, the gamble paid off, and the PABN broke contact. Or at least that's what it seemed. A medevac chopper was dispatched immediately, but as its rotors descended toward the clearing, a single devastating shot, fired from a hidden 57mm recoilless rifle, slammed into its fuselage. The aircraft spun out of control, catching fire the moment it hit the ground. U.S. ground forces rushed toward the wreckage, bullets flying as they pried open the twisted doors. They dragged the pilot and co-pilot out through the flames, but the crew chief was pinned inside, his scream barely audible over the roar around them. Time was running out, and rescuers were forced to make the impossible call. They pulled back, leaving one of their own behind, just as the helicopter was swallowed in a fireball. Across the jungle. If the Americans hoped to prevent the North Vietnamese army from overrunning their forward positions, they had to regroup fast. A counteroffensive was drafted to strike deep into an enemy staging area at the border with Cambodia. However, weeks of torrential flooding had turned the terrain into an impassable swamp, and although the waters had started to recede, the route would not be kind to the Americans. To cut across this uncharted region, troops needed a guide through the jungle. For this, Mike Force was brought to action, an elite unit composed of local indigenous allies. Together with American Special Forces, they pressed forward, carving a path through rain-slicked roads, across rough terrain, and navigating hidden paths. They made it within shouting distance of the border, less than a mile from Cambodia. But before they could take another step, automatic weapon fire erupted from the tree line, tearing into the advancing column. The formation disintegrated, with soldiers throwing themselves behind trees, mounds, and even one another as the enemy surged forward. American and Montagnard troops returned fire, but the volume of incoming fire was too great to match. Before long, U.S. ammunition began to dwindle. Without reinforcements, they'd soon be overrun. The 4th Infantry Division acted fast, mobilizing to reinforce the task force. Overhead, forward air control aircraft, Cider 22, carrying Major Elmer G. Allred and Captain Roy L. Jones, raced in to prepare a landing zone. 3 F-100 Super Sabres were called in, hammering enemy positions with bomb runs to clear the way. But the enemy had prepared for this. As one helicopter swept low to land, a sudden hit found his fuselage. The aircraft was torn apart and plummeted before it could land. A second escort chopper veered to investigate and was instantly shredded by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Despite the danger, Captain Charles D. Henderson, orbiting above, was tasked with coordinating more airstrikes. He dodged flak and enemy fire while directing waves of gunships and fighter jets toward entrenched enemy gun emplacements. He later remembered, quote, "I tried to keep them as high as I could for as long as I could, in hopes that we would knock out most of the guns." But the enemy fire was unforgiving. One helicopter gunship dove low to cover the extraction of downed crew members and was struck mid-dive. Henderson watched helplessly, quote, "It looked like a sheet of flames. When it hit, it burst into flames, rising 25 feet above the ground." As one of the helicopters fell to the ground, a gunner jumped ship and landed right in the middle of a group of North Vietnamese fighters. They looked at the American with a stunned expression, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Before anyone could react, he disappeared into the jungle as bullets flew past him. Above, the battle continued. Night Raid. The North Vietnamese assault became so overwhelming that the Americans were left with a single option: total retaliation. Entire fleets of U.S. aircraft were summoned to the field. Major Hawkins, a forward air controller helping coordinate the aerial battle, later recalled the chaos of the moment, quote, "I had at one time 3 flights orbiting, waiting to get on. They were almost coming at me too fast." The air filled with the sound of jet engines and the thunder of exploding ordnance. Bombs fell in rapid succession. Napalm bloomed across the treetops, and streams of cannon fire stitched the jungle floor. It was a brutal campaign, but as payloads kept raining down, the enemy's muzzle flashes slowly began to fade. As darkness fell and the last aircraft returned to base, Hawkins reported back, quote, "There was absolutely no more ground fire coming at us, so I assumed that we got all the guns that were in position." But the calmness of the moment would not last long. As members of the 4th Infantry Division settled into their hastily dug positions near the Cambodian border, Staff Sergeant Frederick R. Schneider Jr. sat in his jeep beside the command post, reading a letter from his wife. Then came a distant thump, and another, and another. At first, Schneider dismissed the sounds. Then the ground trembled. The echo of incoming mortars became unmistakable. He tossed the letter aside, grabbed a cluster of telephone handsets, and dove into the sandbag command post in order to call for immediate air support. Overhead, Captain Arlo P. Wenstrand and Captain Roy L. Jones arrived in their O-1 Bird Dog, circling low. From there, they could get a clear picture of the scene. An entire regiment of over 1,000 NVA troops was charging toward the perimeter. As the Americans braced for the onslaught, A-1 Sky Raiders dove into the fray. But the moment they arrived in the area, they were met with a wall of fire. Newly positioned anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the air with tracers. One of the pilots, Lieutenant James R. Ting, later remembered the moment, quote, "Well, I couldn't believe it, but sure enough, there were red golf balls flying all around my airplane." However, with exploding mortars all around them, pilots now had visual targets to go after. Napalm rained down, igniting anything that moved. Yet from below came desperate voices from ground troops over the radio, stating, quote, "We need it closer. We need it closer." Lieutenant Ting pushed his aircraft lower, down to just 100 feet, flying dark with his lights off to evade the enemy's sight. Communications between aircraft became dangerously improvised. Pilots had to maneuver in impossible conditions. Some of them would later reveal, quote, "We came in with our lights off and simply called out off left or off right to give each other an idea of where the other aircraft was so we wouldn't hit each other." Still, every 40 seconds, another attack run was made, each one closer than the last. Munitions tore into the enemy ranks, within feet of American positions. From the ground, the company commander radioed up, quote, "That's just right. It's just perfect. Please don't bring it any closer." Knockout. The non-stop American aerial bombardment finally began to take its toll, and the North Vietnamese started to let up, giving enough cover for the battered task force that had first ventured into the zone to be pulled back to Play Jureng. In just 3 days, the unit had lost nearly a quarter of its men, and though they'd inflicted significant losses on the enemy, their ranks were too thin to carry on. Officials from the 4th Infantry Division made it clear that it was the American aircraft that had saved the day. Later reports would state, quote, "The effectiveness of the strikes can best be judged by the fact that after the strikes, the 4th Infantry Division units moved into the area with little or no opposition. The area, which had previously been a strong defensive position with bunkers, tunnels, and foxholes, was now practically devastated." With that in mind, commanders escalated the offensive. A formation of B-52 Shredder fortresses was called in to blanket suspected enemy concentrations, turning entrenched positions into craters. For the exhausted ground troops, this finally bought them a moment to breathe and regroup. But elsewhere, the fight was far from over. On a different position near the Cambodian border, an isolated American platoon still held its ground, unaware that the enemy was preparing one last push. The jungle exploded in gunfire once more as a coordinated NVA ambush erupted, cutting through the platoon's perimeter before the men had time to return fire. Within minutes, multiple Americans were down. Over the radio came a final transmission, warning commanders that the platoon had lost its leader and that the enemy was marking their positions. Racing to the scene was Captain Earl C. Mazzell, callsign Rash 27. From the cockpit of his FAC aircraft, he could see nothing through the thick canopy and swirling wind-blown smoke. Below, Americans desperately popped smoke grenades to show their location, but the wind betrayed them as it blew off their signals. The enemy took advantage of the confusion, creeping closer, their muzzle flashes now only 160 feet from American lines. But just when collapse seemed certain, salvation came in from the skies. A-1 Sky Raiders and F-4C Phantom IIs dove into the fray, cannons blazing, dropping ordnance across the battlefield and sending the NVA into retreat. By the time Captain Mazzell's fuel tanks were nearly dry, the field had gone quiet, and he would later report, quote, "I was told by the ALO that the Army commander expressed that I should be told that the Air Force had done a good job, and in all probability, we had saved his 2nd platoon from being wiped out." Jungle Ghosts. When the airstrikes concluded, the North Vietnamese offensive finally collapsed. Whatever units remained could only launch weak probes, which were easily repelled by the American troops. U.S. aircraft would occasionally continue to sweep the area, dropping ordnance just a few hundred feet in front of friendly lines as pilots chased retreating enemy fighters back toward the Cambodian border, where many disappeared into the jungle, never to return. In the days that followed, American forces switched from defense to pursuit, launching aggressive search-and-destroy missions through the highlands, in which they uncovered hastily abandoned bunkers, shattered supply dumps, and fortifications scorched by napalm. No major engagements followed, and on December 31, 1966, Operation Paul Revere 4 was officially terminated. It had not been a victory earned lightly. The lives of 100 American soldiers were claimed, and nearly 3,000 airstrikes had been unleashed to hold the line. Yet it was the North Vietnamese who suffered the worst of the battle, with nearly 1,000 confirmed casualties. The U.S. and the 4th Infantry Division had held Play Jureng, broken the enemy's momentum, and stopped a cross-border invasion in its tracks. Today, Play Jureng still stands, yet few locals dare to climb its ridge. In the quiet of the hills, it's said the echoes of gunfire still linger, and the jungle breathes with memories of battle. Journalists who visited the area describe it as haunted ground. As one put it, quote, "The nearby houses all have altars on the street, where a mailbox would sit in the United States, hoping to keep at bay the spirits of those who never came home and hold the line just as the Americans did nearly 60 years ago."